The spring of 1985, Custer County, Nebraska, a season that arrived not with the gentle thaw of promise, but with the dry, rasping breath of a coming trial. The earth was already thirsty. The winter snows had been a lie, a thin blanket that vanished into the air, leaving the ground hard, cracked, and waiting. The winds came early, not from the south with warm rain, but from the west, carrying the dust of states already parched. It was a year etched in worry before it had even properly begun. In a small house on the western edge of Broken Bow, the county seat, lived Elspeth Finch. She was 58 years old, a widow for 3 years. Her husband, Arthur, had been a man of the soil, a man who understood the subtle language of the sandhills, the shift in the wind, the color of the sky. He had left her the house, a modest pension, and a silence that filled every room. Elspeth was a woman of routine, of quiet competence. Her garden was a point of local pride, a riot of peonies and zinnias and carefully tended rose bushes that defied the harsh Nebraska climate. She was seen as a fixture, a respectable, sorrowful woman, navigating the last third of her life with predictable grace. Then came the goats. On the second Tuesday of April, a stock truck, loud and reeking of rust and animal fear, rumbled down her quiet residential street. It backed into her driveway, its hydraulic lift groaning in protest. Neighbors peered through their curtains. The mailman paused his route, resting a hand on his leather satchel. Down the ramp they came, a chaotic, bleeding, clattering flood of life. Not one or two, not a quaint pastoral hobby. 47 goats. They poured into her front yard, the one with the prize-winning roses. A mix of breeds, a motley crew of rugged survivors. There were Boer goats, thick-bodied and white with reddish-brown heads, their Roman noses held high. There were Spanish goats, smaller, wiry, in a dozen different colors, black, brown, white, spotted. They were the feral descendants of animals brought by Spanish explorers, tough enough to thrive on rock and thistle. A few Nubians were mixed in, with their long, pendulous ears and arrogant expressions. They were an army of browsers, of foragers, of four-legged locusts. Elspeth Finch stood on her porch and watched. She held a clipboard. She made a check mark for each animal that trotted past. 47, the exact number she had paid for. The truck driver, a young man with a sunburned neck, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He had one question for her, a question that hung in the air for the whole town to ponder. He did not ask it directly. It was in his eyes, the raised eyebrow, the slow shake of his head as he took her signed receipt. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. The transaction had taken place 3 days prior at the livestock auction in Kearney. It was a place of men, a place of cattle, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the price of a pound of beef. The air was thick with the smell of manure, coffee, and nervous sweat. The auctioneer's call was a rhythmic, hypnotic chant, a language understood only by the initiated. Elspeth Finch had walked in alone. She wore a simple cotton dress and her late husband's worn canvas jacket. She did not look at the pens of prize-winning Angus or the nervous Hereford calves. She went to the miscellaneous pens in the back, the forgotten stock, the cull animals, the goats. The auctioneer barely slowed his cadence for them. Lot 214, 47 head of mixed-breed browsing goats, suitable for brush clearing, sold as is. He started the bidding at $20 a head. Silence. The ranchers were there for cattle. The farmers were there for equipment. Goats were a nuisance, a punchline. Elspeth raised her hand, a single steady gesture. The auctioneer, surprised, acknowledged her bid. $20 from the lady in the back. He scanned the crowd. No one else moved. Sold, he barked, the gavel cracking like a rifle shot. 47 goats at $20 a head. $940, plus commission, plus trucking. The total came to $1,112. She wrote a check from the account she shared with her late husband. The bank teller who cashed it the next day told her sister, who told her neighbor, and by noon, the news was all over town. Elspeth Finch had spent over $1,000 on goats. The community reaction was swift. It was uniform. It was a wave of disbelief that crashed in the aisles of the grocery store, over the counter at the feed co-op, and in the hushed conversations after the Sunday service. Laughter at first, a good joke. Old man Hemlock, who had ranched in the county for 60 years, heard the news while buying fencing staples. He laughed so hard he had to lean against a sack of feed corn to catch his breath. He said she'd have been better off setting fire to the money. At least it would have kept her warm for a minute. Then came the pity. Poor Elspeth. Arthur's passing had finally broken something inside her. The women of the Church Auxiliary Society discussed it over coffee and cake. They decided to organize a meal train, the traditional response to tragedy. A casserole for the woman who had bought 47 goats. It was a gesture of kindness wrapped in a judgment. They saw a woman unmoored, adrift in a sea of sorrow, grasping for, what? For the chaos of 47 bleeding animals in her manicured front yard. The yard was the first casualty. The roses went in an afternoon. Stripped clean, the thorny canes gnawed down to nubs. The peonies vanished overnight. The neat green lawn, a symbol of small-town order and prosperity, was systematically dismantled. The goats were efficient, relentless. They ate the grass, the weeds, the flowers, the bark on the ornamental shrubs. Within a week, the yard was a patchwork of green and brown. Within 2, it was becoming a dirt lot. Sheriff Brody was the one who had to deal with the official complaints. He was a big man, calm and deliberate, a man who believed in order. His office was small, smelling of old paper and gun oil. The complaints started as phone calls. Mrs. Gable from next door, her voice trembling with indignation. The goats were staring at her. They were loud, they smelled. Then came the formal petitions. The city councilman who lived down the street cited Ordinance 7B, the one about keeping livestock within town limits. He cited the public nuisance clause. He cited the health code. Sheriff Brody drove his cruiser to Elspeth's house. He found her on the porch, watching the goats. They had already transformed the landscape. The yard was a study in brown. Bare earth packed hard by hundreds of small hooves. The only green was a stubborn patch of thistle the goats had not yet gotten to. Brody took off his hat, wiped his brow. He explained the situation, the ordinances, the neighbors. He was gentle, respectful. He had known her and Arthur for years. He suggested a solution. Perhaps she could find a pasture for them out of town. He knew a fellow with some land to lease. Elspeth listened patiently. She did not seem angry. She did not seem crazy. She seemed calm, resolute. She looked at the sheriff, her eyes clear and steady, and said, "No." Just that one word. No. She offered no explanation, no defense. She just sat on her porch, the queen of her dusty, goat-filled kingdom, and refused to yield. To understand the town's reaction, you had to understand Custer County. This was cattle country, a world built on a foundation of beef. The rhythms of life were dictated by the needs of the herd. Calving season in the spring, haying in the summer, weaning in the fall. The men who ran the county were cattlemen. They measured their wealth in acres of grassland and heads of Angus and Hereford. Their world was one of fences, of order, of carefully managed pasture. Grass was a sacred crop. It was the engine of their economy. Goats were the antithesis of this world. They were agents of chaos. They didn't respect fences. They ate not just grass, but the things that cattle wouldn't touch. Weeds, shrubs, tree bark. They were seen as animals of last resort, for people who couldn't afford a good cow. To choose goats, to bring them not just into the county, but into the town itself, To set them loose on a perfectly good lawn was an act of profound cultural heresy. It was a rejection of everything the community held dear. And there was another reason for the scorn, a deeper, more practical one. A shadow creeping across the landscape that all the ranchers saw, and all of them fought. The eastern red cedar. It was an invasive species, a tough, evergreen tree that was slowly, relentlessly conquering the grasslands. A single cedar tree could drink up to 30 gallons of water a day, starving the precious grass around it. Its dense canopy shaded out the native prairie. Its fallen needles created a sterile mat where nothing else could grow. Worst of all, it was a torch waiting for a spark. The oil in its needles was highly flammable. A cedar-infested pasture was a wildfire hazard of the highest order. The ranchers fought a constant, expensive war against the cedar. They cut them down with chainsaws. They bulldozed them into great piles and burned them. They sprayed them with herbicides that cost a fortune and poisoned the soil. It was a grim, grinding battle against an enemy that never slept. And what did goats love to eat more than almost anything else? Young cedar trees. The irony was lost on everyone. They saw the problem, and they saw the goats, but they could not connect the two. To them, the goats were just another pest, like the cedars themselves. Elspeth's strange act was viewed through the lens of grief, of madness, never through the lens of a calculated strategy. She was a woman, a widow. What could she possibly know about land management that these seasoned cattlemen did not? She did not explain herself, she just watched, and her goats just ate. The spring withered into summer. The rains never came. April was dry. May was drier. By June, the word drought was on everyone's lips. The sandhills, a unique ecosystem of grass-stabilized sand dunes, began to show the strain. The lush green of a normal year faded to a pale olive, then to a brittle yellow. The ponds and creeks shrank. The Loup River, the lifeblood of the region, grew sluggish and shallow. The ranchers watched their pastures burn up under the relentless sun. They started selling off their herds early, taking huge losses, rather than paying for expensive hay that was becoming harder and harder to find. The air grew thick with a constant haze of dust. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, devoid of clouds. The heat was oppressive, weeks on end of triple-digit temperatures. The nights brought no relief. The cicadas buzzed in a frantic, deafening chorus from dawn till dusk. People's tempers grew short. The town felt like a tinderbox, emotionally and literally. Red flag warnings became a daily occurrence. A single spark, the meteorologists on the radio warned, could ignite a catastrophe. People stopped burning their trash. Farmers carried fire extinguishers on their tractors. A collective, unspoken anxiety settled over the county. Elspeth Finch's yard was now a desert, a flat expanse of bare, gray-brown dirt packed as hard as concrete. The goats had eaten everything. Every leaf, every twig, every blade of grass. They had stripped the bark from the 2 small elm trees in the yard as high as they could reach. They spent their days clustered in the shade of the house, panting in the heat, their work complete. The yard was an eyesore, a scandal, a barren, ugly testament to one woman's inexplicable folly. It was a wound in the fabric of the town. Sheriff Brody had visited her 3 more times. The pressure from the town council was immense. They threatened legal action, fines, confiscation of the animals. Brody was caught in the middle. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of compassion. He saw no malice in Elspeth, only an immovable certainty that he could not comprehend. On his last visit, in late July, he had given her a final warning. The council was meeting on the 1st of August. They were going to issue a court order. He would have to enforce it. He would have to come and take the goats. He might even have to arrest her if she resisted. He pleaded with her. "Elspeth, please, don't make me do this. Just tell me why. Give me a reason I can take to them." She had looked at him, not with fear, but with something that looked like pity. She looked past him, to the west, where the sky was hazy with dust. "Sheriff," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you are worried about the wrong things. You are worried about my lawn. You should be worried about the trees." He didn't understand. He left her house that day feeling defeated, confused, and sad. He was going to have to arrest Arthur Finch's widow. The last day of July arrived on a blast of superheated air. The temperature hit 110 degrees by noon. The wind, a hot, searing gale, howled out of the southwest at 40 miles per hour. It picked up the topsoil from the failed cornfields and threw it against the houses. The sky turned a sickly brownish orange. It felt like the end of the world. The radio announcer's voice was grim. A red flag warning was in effect. Humidity was in the single digits. Conditions were as bad as they could possibly be. The spark came at 2 in the afternoon, 10 miles southwest of town. A bearing on a hay baler seized up in a dry, brittle field. It glowed red-hot for a moment, and then the field exploded into flame. The farmer, a man named Peterson, tried to beat it out with a shovel. It was hopeless. The wind snatched the flames and threw them across the pasture. Within minutes, a small fire became a raging front a quarter-mile wide. Peterson got on his tractor and fled for his life. The volunteer fire department was scrambled. Old men and high school boys in yellow coats driving antiquated pumper trucks. They were brave, but they were no match for what was coming. The fire hit a dense stand of eastern red cedar that had encroached on a stretch of rangeland. The trees didn't just burn, they detonated. The oily needles vaporized into a flammable gas, creating a firestorm. The flames leaped hundreds of feet into the air. The roar was deafening, a physical presence that shook the ground. The fire began to move, not at the speed of a man walking, but at the speed of a horse galloping. It was creating its own weather, its own wind. It was unstoppable. The evacuation order for the western edge of Broken Bow came at 3:30. Sheriff Brody was coordinating the response, his voice hoarse from shouting into the radio. He drove his cruiser down the streets, his siren wailing, using the loudspeaker to order people out of their homes. "This is not a drill. Evacuate to the east. Go now." People poured out of their houses, their faces masks of panic. They grabbed photo albums, pets, children. The smoke was already thick, acrid. The sun was blotted out, replaced by an eerie, pulsing orange glow. The fire reached the town limits just before 4 o'clock. It was a solid wall of flame, 300 feet high, moving faster than a man could run. It consumed everything in its path: pastures, fences, barns, houses. It came to the western edge of town, to the street where Elspeth Finch lived. The firemen made a stand there, a last desperate line of defense. They knew it was futile, but they had to try. Sheriff Brody was there, helping them run the hoses. He looked down the street and saw Elspeth's house. She was on the porch. She hadn't left. She was just sitting there, watching the apocalypse approach. And then the fire hit her property line. It was a moment of terrible, awesome beauty. The wall of flame, a living entity of pure destruction, slammed into the edge of her yard. And it stopped. Where there should have been grass, there was only bare dirt. Where there should have been shrubs and trees to fuel the inferno, there was nothing. The fire had no purchase. It had no fuel. It was like a wave crashing against a stone breakwater.
The flames licked out over the barren ground, found nothing to consume, and retreated.
The immense, irresistible force of the firestorm met the simple, immovable fact of an empty space. The fire didn't go out, it parted. Like a river flowing around a rock, the massive wall of flames split, diverting to the north and south, following the fuel lines of the neighbors' green lawns and landscaped yards. It consumed Mrs. Gable's house to the south in a furious whoosh of fire. It took the city councilman's two-story colonial to the north,